Welcome to the Banner of Truth magazine podcast, where each week we bring you selected content from the magazine for your encouragement and edification. This week we've got a bonus episode for you in the form of an interview with Joe Barnard. Joe is lead pastor at Holyrood Evangelical Church in Edinburgh, and he leads a men's discipleship ministry, Cross-Training Ministries. We trust you'll find the following interview encouraging as we talk about Joe's upbringing, his call to ministry, pastoral work, and his discipleship ministry focused on men. Well, we're really happy to be joined by Joe Barnard, who is the minister at Holyrood Evangelical Church here in Edinburgh. Thank you so much, Joe, for sitting down with us.
It's a real joy to be here.
Now, I gather that you grew up in the south of the United States, a state which I'm tempted to pronounce as Louisiana, but I bet no one says it that way, where you come from. Could you tell us a bit about what it was like growing up there and a bit about the state of Louisiana and its history?
Yeah, Louisiana, I think, is an interesting place in the South. Anybody who is interested in church history, Reformed church history, it's a French-Spanish heritage. And so strangely, in the midst of the Bible Belt, there's this pocket of an area that's really predominantly Roman Catholic. And so that's where I grew up. And often people talk about, the Mississippi River. You kind of get west of it, and that's where Reformed theology dies in that part of Louisiana. So it was an interesting church spiritual environment to grow up in. At the same time, a place that's really interesting and dynamic and pulling on a lot of different cultural heritages, right in New Orleans in particular. So a place that's definitely distinct from what people think of when they imagine the South in their minds. Yes.
And in terms of topography, I have an image of a place where there are swamps and not much farmland. Is that wildly inaccurate? What are you looking at when you touch down in Louisiana?
Well, I think one of my favorite things about New Orleans is they had to build a hill at the zoo so kids could experience elevation. So it's flat, is what I'm saying. And certainly lots of swamps and all of the interesting animals that come with those. So, you've got all of the alligators and snakes that make a place exotic.
Wonderful. Could I ask you how you came to know the Lord and what was your journey from that place to eventually discerning a call to ministry?
So I grew up divorced parents very young. My father wasn't a Christian. My mom was. And my earliest memories are of watching her pray, listening to her pray. And at the time, us having some real need and honestly, dramatically seeing God provide and answer her prayers. And so I grew up with a real keen awareness that there was a living God and a heavenly Father. She taught me a lot about the Bible. I think it took me probably into my teenage years to discover the reality of sin and that being a real personal issue. And so those being formative years in terms of beginning to learn the gospel, recognize my own need. Around that same time, kind of late high school, and South Louisiana, as I mentioned, not an area that's been a hub of kind of robust evangelicalism or Reformed theology. There was a church plant that we were a part of, a PCA church plant, and in that space of beginning to grow spiritually, I found out about Scotland and about a possibility of spending a gap year up in the Scottish Highlands. And so strangely ended up having a year very far, very much removed from what we just described up in the Scottish Highlands, but a year where there wasn't much to do. Anybody who's been to the Scottish Highlands, it's not necessarily an exciting place with tons of distraction, especially if you go back a couple of decades, but a place where I had a lot of time to pray, to walk. And honestly, even looking at the bookshelves, I think back to, reading Whitefield sermons, just on the hills. And so I think in that year already, the Lord beginning to place an interest, which took time to develop, but an interest to pursue a call to ministry.
Skipping forward, you're now minister at Holyrood Evangelical Church, but you also are involved with Cross-Training Ministries. How did that ministry develop, and could you tell us a bit about your burden for men?
So several years after what I just mentioned, the Highlands, I ended up being back in Scotland, ended up pastoring a church in a rural village in the Highlands. And over the course of that time, as that church was revitalized, began to have men, young men, some new believers, some who had been Christians, but nonetheless seemed stagnant in their faith, began to disciple these men and bumping into an issue, recognizing that I could preach to them on a Sunday, maybe twice on a Sunday. I could meet every week, but it seemed like they were just hitting what felt like a ceiling of growth. And part of the issue was the way in which I think just modern life is structured to put people in a place where it's very difficult to grow. All of the influences that have always existed, they've kind of been exasperated by technology and some other things. And so I ended up taking 3 years between my first ministry in Scotland, coming back and then pastoring again, really just developing a men's ministry and trying to ask that question: what does it take to set men up to grow in a modern context, recognizing so much is the same, and yet there are some specific challenges that need to be thought deeply about, and men need help with those things, and specifically to do what we can do. Obviously, the Holy Spirit is the grace of God that produces the growth, but what can Christian leaders do to help men?
And from that place, cross-training ministries now exists as something that men can look to for help with that. How can people access and get in touch with cross-training?
All the ordinary means: podcast, website. There are short-term programs. There are books. These resources are available. I think probably the place to begin is the first book of the ministry was The Way Forward, a roadmap to spiritual growth for men in the 21st century. But I think part of why that book's helpful is the first section is trying to diagnose the problem. I think a lot of men, as they kind of sit back in churches, the subtext of a lot of sermons is, just kind of try harder, which is there's an element of truth that guys do sometimes need to exert themselves. But at the same time, I think if they can get an honest diagnosis of really seeing that there's multiple aspects, some are the deep, hard issues, but some are the distraction or the loneliness or those type factors. And if they can kind of recognize, okay, no, this really seems to describe the struggle I'm up against, they're that much more interested in what's the next section, which is to talk about, let's talk about what are the things needed to help you grow.
Absolutely. How did local churches have a role to play in forming men, and how does that formation of men take place in a way that makes full use of what God intends the church to be?
Yeah, I think if you look back, even the model of, say, the Apostle Paul's ministry. There's an emphasis there on investing in the likes of Timothy and Titus and encouraging them to invest in other men. That is very much even as you read the description of his life, he spent so much time and energy doing that. And there's so many things pastors should be doing. This is part of the challenge. But it's interesting how often the thing that gets bumped off the list is that investment in people who have real potential to become those spiritual leaders. And so I think it's so vital that this is recovered. It's a difficult thing sometimes to find time and to know how. And I think to even connect with, especially the younger generations. But I think there's always so many young men hungry for mentorship. And I'm always amazed at how quickly they're willing to say yes if they get an invite to spend time with someone like a pastor.
That's really helpful. So The Way Forward, a roadmap of spiritual growth for men in the 21st century, was your first book. And in some ways, you, after spending some time looking at the problem, you propose a helpful solution in the form not of just a list of things to do, but a roadmap that men can walk on. Spiritual disciplines are a part of that. Some Christians, as soon as they hear the term, are a little bit put off and a bit anxious about spiritual disciplines. Where do you think some of those anxieties tend to come from, and what do you say to people who are wrestling with them?
I think one of the biggest ones comes from a kind of sloppiness in terms of thinking about what legalism is, which is a perennial danger. We want to recognize that. But that effort to, obey the law or to use one's own personal righteousness to have a status, a right standing with God. I mean, that's always something that we want to guard against. But what we sometimes do is then think any exertion of effort to do something is either legalism or is somehow conflicting with the work of the Spirit. And so, right behind me, you've got these beautiful volumes of John Owen. And I think one of the things, for example, Owen is so good with is talking about how the Spirit uses the way that we've been made, and that we don't have to have this kind of competitiveness where either it's the Spirit or it's myself, but in a real sense, with that humility, we can work with the Spirit. And I think, again, on the table, there's names like J.C. Ryle, not afraid to talk about the importance of repeated habits. Thomas Chalmers, very much his understanding of the human person. He spends a lot of time in his both moral philosophy and his systematics talking about the place of habit, which is built on discipline. And so I think it's one of these things that, whether it's the sort of hangover of the old Keswick, let go, let God, or whatever, these things have made us uncomfortable with the fact that not even the great theologians, I mean, the New Testament itself, Paul is exhorting us. And so that means to put forth strategic effort, to repeat the things that we know are real means of grace, trusting that none of it is going to come because of the discipline. It's going to come from the grace of God that he often, uses those disciplines to bring to us.
So we're quite inexact and sloppy in the way that we can apply that term legalism.
I think that's right, yeah.
Cutting ourselves off from actually life-giving sources of spiritual growth. That's very helpful. Your second book perhaps also has a primary application to men, Surviving the Trenches, Killing Sin Before It Kills You, although, of course, principles in it are applicable to everyone. Now, anyone familiar with John Owen, whose name you just mentioned, is going to detect something Owenian in Killing Sin Before It Kills You. How does this whole idea of mortification play into the spiritual life? This is something that Owen talked about, but I believe it has scriptural roots. Could you tell us a bit about what the significance of mortification is in the Christian life?
You think of the text that Owen is using for his great work, or at least beginning with that Romans 8:13 about if you live according to the flesh, you will die. The seriousness in Paul, put to death your earthly members, Colossians 3:5. That this is something that throughout the New Testament, the spirituality that the apostles are passing on is, again, a kind of earnestness to really deal and to have a kind of zero tolerance attitude toward that remnant of sin that is a constant struggle for us. I think what's interesting is the way that a lot of Christians can be in churches a very long time and never get any focused teaching on that specific topic. Or what they're given are the kind of sound bites that might look good on a social media meme, but aren't much help when it comes to the actual, what does it look like to not just in self-reliance or using life management techniques to deal with these sins. And so you've got all of the kind of classic wisdom that, the Owens and others were distilling and communicating, but then you've also, I think, got fresh contexts in which old sins need to be dealt with. And so I think part of that book in particular, toward the end, is trying to think about some of the specific things that never go away, the pride and the lust, but equally, what is slothfulness? What is vanity? Some of these things that we don't talk as much about. What are they, and how do we deal with those kinds of things, which in an environment where, say, social media, there's so much self-promotion, we need to think about this even more acutely maybe than prior generations that didn't have the same access to self-promote.
Absolutely. I'm just wondering if we can take it down to a more practical level and maybe talk about one of the themes you address in the book. Are you happy to pick one of the areas that you've identified as being of particular relevance to us today?
In terms of thinking about sinful passions in that realm? Yeah. Again, I think that one of vanity, and I think that's maybe the wrong label. It's hard to get the right word, but you think of the kind of anxiety that we feel regarding of our worth and our status. You think of how much Christian talks, how many books people are having to consume over this topic of identity. There's something, beneath that is a fundamental pervasive problem that many of us, we're not getting much traction with. And I think often we're doing it naively. So for example, not recognizing how we've been made. So, we are social animals. We need to be loved by God. We also need to be loved by one another. So how in those waters where we're built in this way, that we need in one sense to be loved and appreciated. At the same time, there's this parasite that feeds off that desire in ways that we know are self-destructive. How then do we take the gospel? How do we apply it? And what does it look like? What is the counter virtue? What does it look like to have that robust sense of worth that's grounded in the grace of God, not just in that performance? All of that. There's so many interesting questions there to try to help people untangle what they're really wrestling with, untangle the social environment that is feeding these unhealthy appetites, but equally nourishing what's good, not killing that, so that we can actually have positive spiritual growth. I think there's not, and I hope people realize this, there's not a soundbite you can take away and deal with that vanity. But nonetheless, there's lots of resources that the gospel gives us to work with it.
Yes. And you're getting at something there also with mortification, putting sin to death on the one hand, coupled with actually recognizing something good that needs to be brought to life.
Right.
Then theologians have talked about vivification, a long word. How does that feed into the picture of discipleship? And how do we look to the Lord for that kind of change?
Again, I'm looking at Thomas Chalmers due to, he's got an interesting kind of virtue ethic in his theology. And I think often where Christians are weak, we can name some of the vices, but we're not exactly sure what the Spirit's trying to produce in their stead. And so, that book's written to men, and anytime you're talking to men about sin, you've got to take up a topic like lust. But how many men could have a definition of chastity, much less an exciting, compelling view that would actually inspire them to want to not just put something to death, but to grow into a real pure heart, recognizing the benefits of it, not just in terms of, their marriage, but as Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount, the capacity of a pure heart to see God. And so part of that vivification is really reaching, again, I'm looking at Edwards here, reaching that place where we have this picture of whether it's the affections or whether it's the character traits, it's the freedom of how we've been designed to be, but where we have such a rich view of that it's not going to do all the work. I mean, we live with any number of struggles, but nonetheless, if we don't have that, we're never going to have that vivification. We're just not going to have the kind of renewable motivation to day in, day out live for Christ. And so, Paul, he's doing it again, as soon as in Colossians 3, you're putting something to death, but then you're putting something on. And so knowing the mechanism, how God's doing, but equally knowing the end, what he's trying to produce in us. I think that's such a vital part of putting sin to death, but also seeing this vivification.
Yeah. That's really helpful. And I think helpful for people just to have a framework within which to think about Christian growth, to be able to name things correctly, avoiding errors on both sides. As well as teaching, you are also providing materials for people who are keen to grow spiritually. And I'm thinking of your latest book, which is entitled Hymn Workouts, 100 Exercises to Set Your Heart Ablaze. Could you tell us something about the burden of that book?
So we all know we're distracted, and we're all aware of addictive technology. We're not always as good at recognizing the high risk of that venture. I'll point to Chalmers again. When Chalmers is going to talk about the attention, he's going to talk about whatever gets your attention is going to get your heart. And so the stakes of this are our affections. It's our love. So it's not a small thing to be content and distracted. Now that's only the awareness of the problem. Really what we're after is something positive. We don't just want to avoid distraction. We want to actually cultivate a spiritual mindedness, what Owen in one of these classics is going to describe. And so, this book, Hymn Workouts, it's not just meant to be a theory of, okay, well, what does it look like to have a focused mind, a mind that's really thinking deeply about gospel truth? But one of the great treasures of the Christian past is some of our greatest minds and some of our greatest spiritual in a sense, exemplars of the spiritual life, they've condensed their thought and experiences into little stanzas that are beautiful and memorable to read, incredibly succinct for people who don't have a lot of time to read. And so the idea is to actually have a fairly comprehensive set of hymns that cover a lot of theological ground and kind of experiential spirituality sort of topics. But to use these as actually, in a sense, a script for spiritual mindedness. So we're not just saying that distraction's a problem, we're learning how to focus our mind on gospel truth so all the benefits of that can land in our lives.
So obviously here at the Banner, we want to encourage people to read books. But for those who are really pressed for time, you're saying you can find in hymns excellent material to get to work on if you want to be filled with the greater vision of God's glory. And
the way I would describe it, we're blessed in Scotland. We've got mountains, we've got beautiful hills, and if you have time to go into a national park and to walk through all of it, that's ideal. But sometimes you don't have that time, and there's a spot where your car is directed where you can get out and go sit on a bench, and that bench is going to view that range from one of the most majestic perspectives. You don't want to miss that bench. I think what a lot of these old hymns do is they locate, here's a perspective on the cross or on the ascended Christ or on the ministry of the Spirit that you can't not behold this. And so, yes, if you have time to read, the whole of Owen's volume on the Holy Spirit, by all means, you'll get more from that. But if you're just starting out and struggling, here's maybe 5 stanzas. And if you take time, consistently over generations, Christians have said, if you look at it from this angle, it affects your heart. And I find that when Christians take that time, the same happens to them.
Wonderful. Fantastic encouragement to engage with a rich tradition of hymns for our spiritual benefit. You have been good enough to pick out some Banner books that have impacted you over the years. Would you be happy to introduce us to a few of them?
Yes. Many of these I've already mentioned. And let me start. I think this slim volume, again, of spiritual mindedness of John Owen. Like I said earlier, we live in an age increasingly we're aware of distraction, but being able to develop a mind that has the discipline, but not just the discipline, also knows the topics or the themes or the truth to allow the mind to alight onto. Such a helpful, both laying the groundwork and giving really pragmatic, helpful, everyday advice. I think it's something that I just find so relevant in the 21st century with all of its challenges. Some of these are just personal heroes. I mean, you've got the letters of Thomas Chalmers. I think Chalmers is someone people love the idea of the man because he was one of those whose life was as interesting as his writings. But his writings themselves are of great value. And so here are his letters, and I think just his legacy, both in what he did in terms of mentorship, in terms of church reform, but equally in terms of, I mentioned before, I think there's some of his thoughts on specifically the spiritual life, his understanding of how we're made, and his kind of philosophy of the mind and of the heart. That with his preacher's instinct, I find whether his letters or his sermons just really touch my heart. And finally, I think I'll just mention J.C. Ryle, who I think as I think about being a preacher, the sort of lucidity. Chalmers would always say, find the doctrine. And Ryle is so good. He finds that truth, exactly what he's talking about. He doesn't waste too much time. He gets to the point. He illustrates well. He finds really helpful application. I often read him just to think, not that I want to imitate exactly, but if some of those virtues of what he's doing, if I can translate those into preaching, how beneficial that'll be to anybody who is listening.
Mm-hmm. Some great pointers there. In closing, I like to ask people what gives them hope as they look around at what the Lord is doing in the church, the circles you move in. What's a cause for thanksgiving as we live at a time of great challenge, what's giving you hope as you look at the Lord's work?
I think there's something really startling that whether you were looking at the sort of cultural trends since the Enlightenment, or whether you're just paying attention, 10 years ago to the kind of barking of the Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens types, something that would be really unexpected that's happening. And for me, it's represented, I was reading an article, and it was talking about all of these people who were moving toward the occult, but then this one person who was coming toward Christianity, and this person, kind of this journey toward Christianity began with her sitting down with her boyfriend, and this is what she said, is this question: what if the crazy Christians are right? And there's this interesting moment right now. I think a lot of people are asking this question. They don't know why they're attracted. They don't know a lot about it, but in a really surprising way, in a place like Scotland, which is the vanguard of secularism, there's also an unexpected group of people beginning to ask, what if the crazy Christians are right? And so I think it's a great gospel moment. I think there's lots of opportunity, and in surprising ways, God is moving people to a place of being willing to listen in a way in which I think 5 or 10 years ago I wouldn't have expected.
Well, that is an encouraging thought to end on. Thank you, Joe, for spending time with us. And we're so grateful for you and for the ministry of Holyrood Evangelical Church. And if people do want to follow up and find cross-training ministries, the website is
xtrainingministries.com.
xtrainingministries.com. Joe Barnard, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Banner of Truth magazine podcast. To subscribe to the magazine in print or digital formats, or both, see the show notes or visit banneroftruth.org.